Okay, does that look okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, super. Thanks, Gary. Like Gary mentioned, I'll be talking about management strategy evaluation. The title of my talk is Integrating Models and Stakeholder Objectives to Inform Decision-Making, a quick primer on management strategy evaluation. The key kind of takeaway that I wanted to get across here is that management strategy evaluation is kind of a combination of a complex suite of models, simulation models, but also it's a model for stakeholder participation in the management process at the same time. So the idea here is that we can test kind of a suite of candidate management options, in other words, management strategies, and we end up making a policy decision based on objectives that have been set by stakeholders. And I have this schematic up here, which kind of has some of these components, including a model for a population, uncertainty that goes into the system, and then a management model where we're testing candidates' management options. And then we're comparing the performance of each of the options that we might be testing based on what we call performance metrics. So that's by looking at the performance metrics, we can decide which option is the best. And we can do this kind of in the context of stakeholder participation at the various points in this process. So I'm going to talk about each of these components in more detail, but before I do so, I'm just going to kind of go through a little glossary because there are some jargony terms here. The first term that I'll use is management procedure, which I'll abbreviate MP. And I'm defining this as an adaptable component of a management system. And it could be anything like the way that we design our surveys or the type of stock assessment model that we use or the level of risk that we think is appropriate when defining a catch quota. Or the type of harvest control rule that we're using. And I would probably also refer this to as a management strategy. And when I mention this in some of the graphics, I've got these sort of, set of gears indicating management procedures. Next, performance metric, I'll abbreviate this PM. So this is a measure of fishery or biological population success. It could be catch, it could be spawning stock biomass, or the probability that a fishery is closed. Really, any kind of metric that measures success or an objective that ideally is suggested by a group of stakeholders. I talk about different types of uncertainty here. List 3, could be uncertainties, or I might call them errors. So we have observation uncertainty, which deals with uncertainty in measurements that we make of a system. So for example, if we go out on the trawl survey, we could produce, an index of population abundance, but it's not going to exactly represent what's going on in the population because we always have observation errors. There's also process uncertainties, which is where we might misspecify models in simulations that we make, because models are always going to be generalizations of the truth of the natural processes that are actually occurring. So if we have, say, a model of age against length, typically maybe a von Bertalanffy model, and it's a pretty good generalization, but it's not obviously going to be exactly true for every individual fish. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about process errors or process uncertainty. And then finally, implementation uncertainty, is kind of how well the decisions that we make are actually realized by a fishery. So for instance, if we set a quota at a certain level, what is the uncertainty surrounding what the actual landings are? I'll talk about operating models, which I'm abbreviating OM. So this is a simulation framework that kind of describes the population dynamic processes in a population. So this is anything like growth, recruitment, natural mortality, etc. And then I'll talk about a management model, which kind of includes all components of the management system, which might incorporate data collection, a stock assessment model, where we generate population estimates and also reference points, by which we can kind of gauge the health of the population, and also a model for advice. So in other words, once we have those population estimates and the reference points, the model for advice governs kind of how we translate that into something like a catch quota, if that's the way we're managing. And then finally, an implementation model, which is kind of like a model for fisherman behavior. So something that's going to translate the management advice then into fishery removals, which would be catch. So next, I thought I would give just sort of a very simple word problem and try to kind of relate that to a couple parts of the schematic here. So a really simple example, kind of boiled down of the type of thing that a management strategy evaluation could look at would be something like, what is the long-term impact of changing the level of acceptable probability of overfishing on long-term average catch and annual variability in catch? And so just to emphasize a couple parts here, we have the level of acceptable probability of overfishing. That's an example of something in the management system that we might change. That's a management strategy or a management procedure that we might be looking to evaluate. And then the second part of this is dealing with catch and annual variability of in total catch. So these are, objectives that stakeholders might be interested in, and that's when we're looking at the performance of the overall system. Those are performance metrics. So that's kind of a general overview, and now I'll sort of dive in a little bit more. But sort of before I do, I think it's always useful in presentations when we're talking about fisheries, just to come back to Magnus and Stevens for a second. So I have up here National Standards 1 and 2 from Magnus and Stevens. And National Standard 1 states that we need to prevent overfishing while also achieving optimum yield from our fisheries. And also, we need to do this using the best scientific information that we have available. And so we need specific advice, things like catch quotas, if that's how we're managing our system. But what management strategy evaluation tries to accomplish is, how can we evaluate the system by which we are providing that advice? So just to kind of remind everybody, of the different components of the fishery management cycle, I stole this graphic from NOAA here. So we have these 4 different components here, including data collection. So this would be going out on surveys and ending up with indices of abundance, things like that, collecting biological data, because for at least the more complicated stock assessment models, we need to know things like the length of age or weighted age, etc. And we of course need to have an idea about what the removals are. And then this feeds into the modeling process, where we have a stock assessment model, which oftentimes out of that comes estimates of population size and fishing mortality. and also biological reference points, by which we can use to assess the status of the population. So we have that modeling component, which feeds into the advice model. So once you kind of know something about the stock status, how then do you recommend removals from the system? And then a management model, which kind of deals more with how the removals occur, what the fishery looks like. And so with MSE, this is kind of the part of the system where we're interested in making changes. So MSE is going to evaluate the performance of this system, and we can look at different alternatives in this management process, where maybe we want to compare different types of the stock assessment models. Maybe we want to compare various methods of data collection and what the precision looks like in our collection system, or maybe we want to look at different versions of harvest control rules, etc. So I'm going to go through kind of a few of the key MSE points now. So one critical piece here is that when we talk about management strategy evaluation simulations, we're talking about modeling the entire system here. So we have a model of the population, and we have a model of the management system, and then the important what really sets management strategy evaluation apart is that we also have this feedback loop between the population and management system, and this occurs via a model for data collection. So we have some way to generate observations from the system. So this would be something like a trawl survey or catch monitoring, etc. So we have a model for data collection, and then we also have a model for fishery implementation to kind of connect the management model back to removals from the population. Next, we have to think about how we evaluate the system. And so, what we want to do is specify objectives or performance metrics to kind of understand which of the management alternatives, makes the most sense for the stakeholders. So this is really how we're defining the success of the fishery. So some examples here are maybe we want to look at the long-term average harvest. Maybe we want to look at the long-term average spawning stock biomass, or the probability that overfishing is occurring or that the population is overfished in any given year. Maybe we're interested in the annual variation in the landings. So the plot I have here is just, one example of what a performance metric could be. So it's harvest in this case, and we have 3 different management procedures where that third management alternative, MP3, did best in the harvest performance metric. And so what you could have is a whole suite of these different performance metrics, and then you would kind of use them all together in some way to make a decision with stakeholder input. So what do those alternative management procedures, what could they look like? It really could be, any part of that management system schematic that I had up there. So this could include the way that we do the sampling. It could include different approaches to stock assessment modeling. Maybe you want to compare a simple index-based approach to stock assessment with a more complicated catch at age or catch at size assessment model. Maybe you want to compare different paradigms, where you give advice. So this would be like different versions of harvest control rules. So translating the results of stock assessment, into catch quotas, or however you're managing the fishery. This could deal with the accuracy of the implementation. You know, if you want to choose kind of how evaluate how precisely the fishery kind of hits that quota, and see, you know, how that impacts the long-term performance. And I have this little schematic here where we have 3 management procedures. And so what we're doing is we're running each of the management procedures independently through the MSC model. And then out the other end come performance metrics, the suite of performance metrics that are associated with each of those management procedures. And then comparing among those performance metrics is then how we can, you know, make some decision about how to go forward with a new management system. And finally, I just want to mention the uncertainty component. So it's really critical in these models to incorporate uncertainty of all types, including observation errors, which we talked about before. You know, how well are we actually measuring the system, and process errors, how badly are internal models misspecified, because they always are. And so one, you know, useful thing that we can do in management strategy evaluation is just include different versions of some of these models, because we don't actually know what the truth is. So there could be different versions of the MSC that say have, you know, a different assumption about a stock recruitment relationship or a growth model, etc. And then implementation errors, you know, how closely do catch and landings conform to that management advice is another source of uncertainty. And I like the way that that Andre Punt put this. He has a really good review paper here. And when he talks about uncertainty, he says it's important so that we can understand the realizable performance of each of the management procedures. And so what he means by that is, you know, if we kind of took this to the extreme and said, we're not going to incorporate any uncertainty at all in the system, it might be really easy to differentiate the performance between, you know, the different management procedures. Maybe it's obvious if there's no uncertainty that management procedure 2 is much better than management procedure 1. But when we start including those realistic layers or levels of uncertainty in our observations, in our processes, et cetera, in our fishery implementation, it could very well be that it's now impossible to, you know, differentiate between the management procedures. So that's why it's important to include that uncertainty, because we have to think about, really, can we really tell the difference in outcome between these different methods? And I'll just also mention that, that we're kind of typically underestimating uncertainty when we model fish populations, because even though, say, in a stock assessment model, we're pushing out, estimates of uncertainty in the final product, you're always making an assumption that the underlying model that is used is the correct model. So that's something that we're kind of, trying to deal with in an MSC framework by incorporating different assumptions about different types of models for the processes, the population dynamic processes in the system. So like I mentioned, Andre Punt had this paper, and I thought he did a good job kind of laying out what the steps are for MSC. So I thought I would just repeat those here. So his first step is to identify performance metrics or objectives for the system, and then to consider any uncertainties and develop candidate operating models that include those realistic levels of uncertainty. Determine parameters for each of the operating models. In other words, sometimes we call that conditioning the models. identify the management strategies or management procedures that you want to test, and then run the simulations and interpret the performance measures. And I kind of put together this schematic here based on some of the smaller pieces that I had earlier on in the population. So I thought I would just go through that kind of yet again. So we have our population here, and we have, different types of uncertainty that we're including. And then we have this feedback system with data generation, a data collection submodel, and an implementation submodel, which provides the feedback between the population and the management system, and then any different management procedures that we might be testing, which we can then compare between the management procedures using the performance metrics that we've identified. So I thought here that I would just kind of provide a few very quick looks at some MSE examples that I kind of just really briefly reviewed in the literature here. So the first one was looking at Dungeness crab on the West Coast in a seasonally hypoxic fjord. And the management procedures that they were interested in were managing under different levels of hypoxia, illegal fishing, and incidental mortality. And the performance metrics that they were interested in were fishery catch, population size, and the variance of those measures. The second one was looking at reef fish stocks, and they were looking at the precision of the surveys that were used, to provide indices of the population abundance. And the metrics they were using were how well the populations tended toward BMSY, which would be the state where they would be maximally productive, and also the probability of overfishing. This third one was interesting. This was surf clams in the Mid-Atlantic Bight, kind of in the context of temperature change that might be impacting the range of the stock. And so they were looking at management procedures that had to do with area management, kind of, similarly to the scallop fishery. And the performance metrics that they used were fishable density, number of clams per bushel, landings per unit effort, and the distance traveled by the fleet. And since they had a spatial model here, they could look at that distance traveled. And then finally, I just plugged my own work, I guess, which is not published yet, hopefully soon. But when I was back at Gulf of Maine Research Institute, we were looking at a Georges Bank cod-like species that was where the recruitment was impacted negatively by increasing temperature. And so we were looking at different ways where if we included temperature in developing the biological reference points, how might that change the performance of the population and performance of the fishery over time. And we were interested in catch variability in catch and spawning stock biomass. So all this to say that I think the performance metrics that people look at are typically pretty similar. Catch, spawning stock biomass, always of interest, probably the probability of overfishing. But when you look at kind of the context in which the studies, are made, you have all these, interesting environmental components here, and the management procedures that people are testing sort of, are this really broad range of possibilities. Management strategy evaluation is just this really kind of, flexible framework where you can look at any comparison you can dream up, as long as you kind of have the data to simulate it. So this last component of MSE that I wanted to talk about is the participatory component. So a real important part of management strategy evaluation is kind of the involvement of stakeholders. And stakeholders are going to be anybody that has any interest in, in a fishery or in a population that the fishery acts on. So where can they participate in this process? Well, certainly in defining the performance metrics, because those are the objectives for the fishery or the population, and also possibly in devising the alternative management strategies that you want to test against or compare, I should say. And then definitely in determining the different types of uncertainty that might exist in the population. I think this is particularly important because stakeholder groups typically have a really different experience than the people who are developing the models. So I think this is a really important participatory component here. So I thought I would just bring up the herring MSE just really briefly, and I'm a little bit sheepish talking about it. I'm sure there are people on this call who know a lot more about it than me. I was just sort of paying attention peripherally, but I just talk a little bit about it here. So there were lots of different stakeholders involved, 80 plus different people representing the herring, lobster, groundfish, tuna, and recreational fishing fleets, as well as the whale watching industry and environmental group and agencies and academics. So a whole suite of different stakeholders. And they held workshops in May and December of 2016, where they took input on performance metrics, as well as the management alternatives that they were discussing and the different components of the models. And their operating model included looking specifically, they undoubtedly included, other types of uncertainty, but they were looking specifically at uncertainty in natural mortality, which is M here, kind of productivity, uncertainty in productivity of stock and recruitment, uncertainty in weighted age, and also bias in the assessment model. And one of the interesting parts here is that they also included predator models for highly migratory fish, groundfish, seabirds, and also marine mammals. Because, if you look at the interested stakeholders here, it's not just the herring fishery, it's, other groups, which are kind of affected by what's going on with the herring population, since they're a forage fish. And so what they did was to include models for those predators, which were not as complex as the simulation that they were using for the herring, but just sort of gave an idea about, what might happen to these other populations under the different management policy alternatives. And they were interested in, especially in testing management procedures that were different varieties of harvest control rules. So they had different, they had control rules that were constant catch, biomass-based rules, and some variants, and also a conditional constant catch model. So they were really interested in kind of, how to form the advice. And they tested numerous performance metrics, things like spawning stock biomass, yield, variability in yield, the probability that in any year the population was overfished or that overfishing was occurring, or in any probability that in any year the fishery might be totally closed. They had Min-Yang Lee was working on this project, and he's an economist at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and so that sort of gave them flexibility to kind of go a little bit further in some of the performance metrics, to look at the more economic side of things, things like gross and net revenue. I actually don't know what what ended up happening in this MSE, and whether one of their policy alternatives was actually adopted as a rule, but I would argue that the process that they went through is probably kind of as important as the decision. And to go into that a little bit more in depth, I just wanted to point you to the work of Elinor Ostrom. So she was an economist, and she won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her analysis of economic governance, especially the commons. The commons here refers to common pool resources, which fisheries are, because it's a public resource which kind of theoretically could be accessed by anybody. Other examples of common pool resources might be like water resources out west, or things having to do with air pollution, things like that. But what she did was to look at a bunch of different systems that, different types of common pool resource management. And she looked at, under what conditions were these systems successful in their management, and where did they fail? And she came up with 8 different design principles for successfully managing common pool resource situations. And her third design principle is that individuals that are subject to the regulations have got to have a voice in their development. And so this is something that's really kind of integral to MSC, which is why I thought it applies here. I mean, I think the councils and ASMFC do a really great job of engaging stakeholders. But one thing that's nice about a fully participatory management strategy evaluation is this does this, really intentionally and really systematically by, at different points in the process, taking feedback from stakeholders on the types of policy alternatives that might be interesting, and certainly on what the objectives are for their fishery, and the objectives for the population, and also on the different types of uncertainty that might be important in the system. So just as sort of a takeaway here, I'm going back to kind of that first schematic that I had up. So MSC is always going to be, a complex simulation model where we want to evaluate alternative management strategies, and the evaluation occurs using performance metrics or objectives. And it's important to incorporate, all the different flavors of uncertainty that we know to affect the system. This feedback loop here is really kind of what sets MSC apart from other types of simulations, the feedback between the population model and the management model. And then the other half of it, which is the model for stakeholder participation, where the stakeholders are the ones that are defining success for the population and the fishery, and they're designing the performance measures, and they help design the management procedures and identify the different sources of uncertainty. And they're really kind of an integral part of the MSC process. So that's kind of my introduction to MSC. I hope it was sort of useful. I have some further reading up here. These were the sources that I referred to in this presentation, and this paper is really great. It's kind of a review, this Andre Punt, if you're interested. But yeah, so I'll be happy to have a discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam. Nice job. People have questions for Sam? Mike Pohl has a question from the chat. Let's see if I can. Is MSC more frequently used to project forward, or is it also used retrospectively to validate or invalidate models and assumptions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it could be done either way. I mean, typically it's for sort of this decision-making process, considering possible alternatives that we might use in the future. And I think, one thing that I kind of glossed over a little bit is that sometimes when we talk about MSC, there's kind of 2 different ways that people talk about MSC. The kind of full MSC that I described here, which involves stakeholder participation, et cetera. And I think in a full MSE, you're definitely interested in what's going to happen, in the future. The other way people talk about MSE is kind of more of what they call desktop MSEs or MSE Lite. And so that's a similar type of process, except you're just not really engaging with the stakeholders. And I think in kind of that simpler version of MSE, yeah, I mean, you could certainly kind of go backwards and do a retrospective type analysis, or you could look kind of more into the future. But I think people are typically more interested in what's coming down the road, and how might we be able to adapt our decision-making system to improve the efficiency of our advice.
Other questions?
Jerry? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Micah.
Oh, I was just gonna, since Sam put it out there that the herring example, that we did end up going with the outcome of the MSE, and I think that there was so much of the investment of the work was sort of that interaction with the stakeholders and trying to weigh the trade-offs that come out in those performance metrics, because you can win in some categories and lose in others, and even more importantly, where the public might have thought there was trade-offs, and that the modeling suggested that there really wasn't, that there wasn't a major effect on groundfish stocks from variation in the different types of management procedures you could use for herring. So I think it was sort of like a difficult process workshop to participate in, to have all of the different normally angry groups upset with each other in the same room, but it came out with sort of a compromise that satisfied the most number of people. Was a harvest control rule, sort of, they call it a hockey stick shaped biomass based control rule, and that is what has been used to manage set the quotas for specifications in the past several rounds. And it's sort of the idea is being tested for the first time really now, because the stock has undergone somewhat of a collapse, that we've had some really poor recruitment for several years in a row. And so now we've crept down that ascending limb of the control rule, and whether we stick with that social capital that we created by that investment of all that time, and stick with it, or whether the council and people who have a desire to sort of do something more drastic or different than what the harvest control rules, that's sort of playing out right now in the discussions of the council.
Super.
But it was great.
Thanks.
It was a great talk, Sam. Thank you. It was a good overview.
Yeah, Sam, thanks for your talk. I'm not really sure what my question is, but I'm interested in understanding how this might be able to be applied to issues associated with offshore wind and offshore aquaculture. Are you familiar with how this is used in those, in assessing some of those decision-making processes?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any specific examples, but it's certainly flexible enough to do something like that, because in that case you'd probably be interested in spatial models, and you could definitely do something like that. I mean, I mentioned that the spatial surf clam model, for example. Yeah, I mean, you could definitely apply something like that. It would take, I think, that herring MSE had a whole huge group of stakeholders, and that was just kind of the fishery and marine life people, and that would be sort of a whole nother suite, adding on a whole lot of other people when you're talking about aquaculture or offshore wind, etc. But you could definitely do something like that, and I don't know of any particular examples, but yeah, I mean, there would definitely be some interesting impacts of spatial management and how that would kind of carry through different parts of the system that I think might not necessarily be intuitive, and so you would want to model them basically in some way.
Has there been any challenges in the examples that you're familiar with getting stakeholders to agree to the performance metrics or sort of the management endpoints? So like one issue that we have in offshore wind is that quite a few fishermen just don't even think we should be developing offshore wind. So there's a fundamental opposition to that as a management goal. How could that be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I would imagine that, in a situation like that, not everybody's going to leave happy from the room. But I think the hope is that, you leave with a better understanding of kind of the interests of other people. And so I think that's sort of, a big part of that, of the participatory process. I mean, I think it kind of works both ways. It's good for the, the scientists who are building the models to get get the feedback from the stakeholders. And then it's probably good for stakeholders to kind of, be involved in those discussions so they can sort of see where the other groups are coming from. So, I mean, I have not been involved in kind of a formal full MSE with all the stakeholder participation. So I don't have a specific example of kind of, of how people end up sort of feeling about the process, et cetera. But yeah, I think having everybody in the room is a step in the right direction.
Great, thank you so much. It was a great talk.
Anyone else? Well, hearing none, we'll close the meeting. Everyone have a safe holiday, and we will see you January 5th when Sarah Turner will be talking. Okay, thanks, Sam.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sam.